All right, hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistics Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us. I hope you and yours are staying safe and healthy. While I'm talking, you'll see a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. You'll also see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. We're excited to present this most recent in our series of Meet the Authors webinars from the LSA's flagship journal, Language. We're grateful to our panelists for taking the time to participate as well. A target article, Toward Racial Justice in Linguistics, Interdisciplinary Insights into Theorizing Race in the Discipline and Diversifying the Profession, was published last year in the online-only perspectives section of the LSA's journal Language, with the aim of generating written responses. The article, selected comments, and a response by the authors to those comments appeared in the December 2020 issue of Language. In this webinar, the authors of the target article and the responses discuss the publish and response process, including their motivation for writing the papers or responses, what they would add to them if they were writing now, how this work can continue, and structural barriers to the work. Please feel free to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A function and to chat using the chat function. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the webinar over to the authors of the target article, Ann H. Charity Hudley of the University of California, Santa Barbara, Christine Mallinson of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Mary Buchholz of the University of California, Santa Barbara.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you all here with us. And I am just excited for the conversation that we are going to have today. And we've got basically everyone on this panel today has really worked hard. We're so grateful for all the respondents that are here. And we even have some people who wrote responses that were not published in Language, who we know were on the panel and have published their things online. So some of those will go into the chat. Christine is going to she already put, thank you, our brief agenda into the chat. So today we're going to talk about why we wrote the papers and what we would add or what we would update. The world has changed so much since we started this project. So we want to bring it up to the immediate. And then we want to talk really specifically about how this work can continue. This was for us the first part of this project, really getting the conversation going, but we have particular publications, an edited collection, a two-part edited collection that we're going to invite papers for that has been invited by Oxford University Press. We're going to talk about the structural barriers to the work. So once the work was in the world, what are the things that we started to see and hear and feel based on starting this conversation more in earnest in linguistics? And then we're going to talk about moving forward. So we're going to do this for about an hour. And then we will have time for Q&A for half an hour. And we're going to ask that you use the chat for chatting, but actually use the Q&A function for the questions for that part, just so that we can separate the two and find them easily, given the big numbers of people here. All right. So Christine, Mary, and I are going to kick it off a little bit just with the idea of why we wrote the papers. And then we'll move on to our different respondents. So I think the thing for us is that we just desperately, every day I wake up and stay up late thinking about the brilliant scholars, especially that are coming through linguistics right now, and making sure that they are able to stay part of the linguistics community, particularly as defined by the LSA. And I don't just mean that in the traditional model of assimilation, people from different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, come do this linguistics, but if you do it like this, you'll be safer. Or if you do it like this, you'll be able to get a tenure track job in a particular department. And I lived through that reality. And I think one of the big things that we wanted to contend with in this paper is looking at the scholarship behind that reality and how do we make sure that our students don't have to compromise their intellectual values, their community values, their racial and ethnic values as part of their work, so that they can be in our departments, and the departments and programs will be better for it. So that's really what motivated me. And then I don't know, Christine and Mary, do you want to just give a little overview about why you did that?
I would just echo that, as somebody who I think of myself as an interdisciplinary scholar focused on language, and that has always been a driving motivation for me too, is having students who are also interdisciplinary in their backgrounds, figuring out how they can also be part of these important conversations with all of their insights that they want to bring. So absolutely, that is one of my driving motivations as well.
Thanks. Yeah, again, just echoing what others have said, but also speaking from my own positionality, both as a white linguist and as a department administrator. I'm a department chair. I feel that people in my situation have a special responsibility here. And so I was really honored to be invited to participate in this project with Anne and Christine and to make sure that this work is amplified and spread as widely as possible. I think the urgent issue before us is there are scholars, there are students who are ready and willing and able to contribute to linguistics as a field, but the discipline and departments are not ready for them. And so I see the responsibility of the discipline as doing the remedial work in departments, in institutions like the LSA, to meet scholars and students more than halfway. Right now, they're doing all of the work, and that's not right. So I'm hoping that this conversation will lead to very tangible next steps for a lot of the attendees who are in a position to make change in their own departments and elsewhere in the discipline.
And I think what I'll address next, just in the agenda to set the model for our respondents, is what would I add or how would I update the papers today? So one thing was when this paper came out, it hit right when the pandemic was coming and the Black Lives Matter movement took space. And we didn't know that those things were coming when we started the draft. So obviously we're bringing it up to the moment. And what would I add most from my perspective right now is helping linguists seize the moment that's going on in higher education. Universities are making cluster hires. They're thinking critically about their curriculums, their structure, with respect to people from all different backgrounds, but particularly anti-Blackness in the academy. So if there's one thing that I would add and what I plan to work on for our edited collection is a paper that really looks at anti-Blackness in particular in linguistics and how people have marshaled anti-Blackness basically as a way to study African-American language and culture, but and many times silence the intellectual values of African Americans. So that's kind of what I would do next and really drive people to move while, this conversation is really getting people's attention. Mary Christine, what would you add or how would you update?
I think one of the things that I have seen people really respond to are all of the action items. So, action items for structural inclusion, action items for, dismantling barriers. And I would just love to see more growth on those as well. Tangible things that everyone can do, as Mary was saying, in their roles as whether they're a student, undergraduate student, graduate student, all the way up. So I would love to see more growth in those applied pieces of how we can actually make happen the change that we are talking about.
Yeah, and I think, again, kind of building on that idea of what are the tangible actions we can take. One of the things that maybe I would have foregrounded even more in both of the papers, and maybe especially in the second one, the response to the responses, where we try to give a kind of action plan, is to really notice the dailiness of this, and even minute by minute. As a department chair, I have been sitting in front of my computer all morning having meetings, and I think maybe 4 different actionable items came to my attention or were issues that I needed to deal with around these issues of equity and racial justice. And that was just in a couple of hours. So if people are looking for them, you can make interventions right now, every day. And so that's something I hope people also take away.
All right, so I think that kind of gives us a good frame, and I want to keep us moving along in this hour. So I think our respondents, basically what we'll do, the way we'll do it is we'll start with those same questions to keep that conversation going. And then we'll have a couple more questions in terms of how people see next steps, how this can continue, structural barriers to the work, and also moving forward. So I would invite any of the respondents who really want to address why you wrote the paper to go ahead and pop on now, and we can sort that out from there. All right. So I would say we'll get started. So Michelle, you want to just kick off? Why'd you write the paper?
Well, you see, I was so pleased by when I first read the draft of the paper, because in a way, what you, Anne, Christine, and Mary, what you did is you gave me a lens, a new lens to process my own experience growing up with what I would call the bluest eye, à la Toni Morrison, meaning a linguistic bluest eye in Haiti, where I grew up devaluing my own native language, Haitian Creole. And I got into linguistics, well, to make a long story short, after many detours. And in linguistics as well, I was given that same perspective where I would devalue my own Creole language, including reading the very pages of the general language. Even in language, my native language was being called irregular, abnormal. And of course, since then, I worked a lot on trying to de-learn these paradigms, but your paper made it so clear that the reason for this constant devaluing of my native language was because linguistics itself started as part of this, of white supremacy. So I'm very grateful for that. So I was so moved by the paper. And so my response was looking at Creole studies and my own Haitianness, my own Creole speakerness, and trying to make sense of that. And then what I was able to do as well is to see how even beyond linguistics, there are these tensions between the declared goal of valuing all languages and at the same time devaluing certain languages, especially those of Black and brown people worldwide, including as part of human rights work. So after I wrote this paper, I was able to use that same lens that you presented in that paper in understanding the way that human rights organizations also violate this basic principle of valuing all languages. So one case in point, which is perhaps the most spectacular one, is that of the UN, United Nations, where they have this branch for scientific and cultural work, UNESCO, where UNESCO has these tons of beautiful papers. I've even published in UNESCO's journals, the Prospect, where I document the value of using local languages like Haitian Creole for education. But if you look at the way UNESCO operates in its branches in the global south, like in Haiti, you can see that in the daily practices, they do the same thing that you yourself criticize among linguists. They are very racist they devalue local languages like Haitian Creole. So at UNESCO's conferences and meetings in Haiti, they give more value to French versus Creole, although Creole is a national language. And if you look at the UN, the way they operate in Haiti, even when they have meetings with those in most need of knowledge and communication, they would use French as a way to create barriers against the majority, you see? And then I realized one point that I made in my response to your paper, which is that of Derek Bell's theory of racial interest convergence. The idea is that the power structure will not give up power unless there is some interest in abandoning that power. So in order to make progress on the racial front, we have to find this intersection where those in power can see some interest in creating equal playing fields. And that's one thing which I struggle with every day in my work in Haiti, because I see well-meaning folks like at UNESCO in Haiti, they know the importance of Creole, but they see their own interest in the use of French to promote themselves. So now how do you resolve this tension? How do you create these spaces where those in power can see common interest with those that they oppress? And I think the same issue is true also in linguistics. How do you make sure that those in power in our field see value, common value in allowing a level playing field? So those are the 3 points I wanted to make. But I am so thankful again for your paper to giving us this framework to be able to analyze these tensions and do much better for a better world. So thank you.
Okay, Wes, what about your perspective? And then we'll have Eris and Anna hop back on for a bit.
I wrote the paper because I thought I needed to sort of respond to this. This is hugely, hugely important. It was my tremendous honor to be able to have my commentary sort of included. One of the issues that comes up a lot in discussions of race and racism is that Native Americans and Indigenous peoples in generally are omitted or somewhat overlooked in those conversations, particularly with respect to the other sort of insidious ism that characterizes our experiences and our exclusion in linguistic science and beyond. That other ism in this case I'm referring to as colonialism or settler colonialism. Well, for that matter, there are actually many, many isms that I think must be discussed with respect to race and racism. So my motivation really was to sort of create space, not just for Indigenous people, but especially for Indigenous ideas, Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous intellectual traditions in linguistic science, recognizing that if these are not present, then exclusionary practices will continue. And Anne, did you want me to sort of address the question as well?
Yeah, I was just unmuting to say, I would love you to address the next piece. It's really thinking about, how you would update it and even thinking a little bit about next steps even.
The points that you made about everything that's happened in the last year, of course, are things that I would include as well. We see, the tremendous sort of effects of the pandemic on Indigenous populations, particularly those that are in the present day United States. We need to recognize that the same issues, or many of the same issues that lead to Indigenous exclusion in linguistics, are also promoting sort of those sorts of problems, those broader issues in Indigenous communities. The well, there really are two specific things that I think I would say now that I didn't make in the paper, points that I didn't make in the paper. One is that to really sort of emphasize the idea that ideas about Indigenous values, Indigenous ways of knowing, and how these relate to race and racism are quite widely written about and are discussed and are even sort of offered, and yet people in many cases are not paying attention to them. And frankly, I saw that even at the last LSA meeting, where I continued to see a number of papers where people were talking about Indigenous languages in ways that were completely removed from Indigenous communities, reducing them to objects for our understanding, where our refers to other linguists, and otherwise doing things that in fact, I think, promote exclusion rather than inclusion. The specific thing that I would add now, the specific new content, would be a discussion of the upcoming United Nations UNESCO International Decade of Indigenous Languages. I mentioned the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019 and made a little bit of a critique of that, recognizing that in many cases, particularly from linguists, it gets framed in terms of languages as isolated objects rather than Indigenous communities who claim those languages. And so I'd make a call saying, hey, this international decade is about to start around the next LSA meeting, in fact, in 2022. And it is crucial, crucial, crucial that people engage with Indigenous needs and ways of knowing in order to do positive things with that international decade, lest it end up being yet another period of the study of Indigenous languages as opposed to the sport of Indigenous peoples who claim those languages. That's what I would add.
Thank you. Eris and Anna, did you want to add to that and kind of think about, why you wrote it and then go into some of the other questions a little bit as part of that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll actually let Anna talk a little bit about why we came to the paper, but I think we were really excited to be reading something that talked to a lot of the questions we had as students and how we were in the thick of our kind of academic training and constantly searching for like a guidance that would lead us to the right kinds of questions to be asking and what kind of existed as a valid question. So I'll let Anna talk about that, and then I will end up by saying a little bit what we would have added or what our goals were, what the impact we wanted it to be.
Yes, so as with much of the work that Eris and I do, our inspiration for this response came from some ideas that we saw circulating on social media. So what we referred to actually in our paper as a Twitter beef. But in this case, it was a tweet on academic Twitter that was referencing a bilingual education debate and two perspectives on bilingualism. And it felt like a great jumping off point because not only was it something that was being talked about in a public facing format, which is something that we both value in our identity as scholars, but it was presenting an opportunity to talk about a well-known, well-established debate in our field. And by analyzing an ongoing debate within any discipline, it's good for seeing how the field is going to be progressing in the future, or what sorts of new perspectives are emerging. But it was also a good entry point toward a discussion on equity, both specifically in bilingual education that we were referring to, but also toward the actual process of developing these research questions and whether those questions are considering the socio-historical conditions of the populations that they're addressing. So by referring to discussions of race and ethnicity as, unnecessary baggage for linguistic studies, which is some of the criticism that these sorts of studies have received in the past, you're creating blind spots around the fact that culture, race, community, all these social factors are intertwined and inseparable from language in practice and even within an educational context. But kind of to circle back to this current paper, I have to credit Eris for originally reaching out to collaborate on this after she had witnessed said Twitter beef around the time that the call for responses emerged. So we had both kind of heard from our mentors that we would do great in collaboration, which was a very central theme and thing that we were advocating for in our paper. And it was our first project together that allowed us to see how that sort of collaboration was showing our individual strengths and really letting us both shine as scholars. So yeah, because we had come from such different backgrounds, we saw that it was necessary to address how that affects the questions that we form in the first place. And not only that, but how we look at and interpret the data. So I think that Eris is going to have some more to say about that. I'll turn this over to her.
Yeah, so the way that we structured our paper was really kind of answering to that question of how are we being responsive to the communities that we are investigating in the way that we're forming the questions? How are they present in the process of thinking about the questions? And if we have blind spots, who are we working with in order to take those blinders off, right? So if we're going to be talking about a particular language and there are other scholars in the field that come from that background, how can we create collaborative relationships with those scholars so that we know that we're kind of investigating things from the positions of the people who we're investigating? So I think that one of the most important things that we wanted to acknowledge was that it's not enough to investigate what has been called a minority language, right? It's not enough to just say, okay, well, now you know what this language is. It exists. These are the features of it. We also have to think about the questions, the basic questions that we have been told are valid, the basic methodologies that we have been told are valid, and how those methodologies and questions leave silences or places that we're not able, or questions we're not able to ask. I think if we were to write this paper again, one of the things that we would do is have some more directed language about how to support graduate students in their arrival to questions that are language related. That is just a lot more expansive than what we've traditionally been told. I think that we probably would have had more directed language about the difference between equal and equity, so that when we're saying that there needs to be efforts to create more equity in the field, it's not just about making something visible, but it's about actually action-oriented steps that can be taken in order to redress some of the harm that's been caused by our field, some of the redress that's been caused by just academic spaces in general, and then obviously colonial frames of power and the society that we exist in general. So I think for Anna and I, we have just in our youth been kind of steeped in processes of social justice, and we probably would have added more directed action items for how to redress some of that harm.
Thank you so much. Other respondents, do you want to jump in a little bit with your why, or you could pick the next question up? How do we see this moving forward? So I see Alice popping on.
Hi. So yeah, on the why, my paper is a collaborative one between myself and Leslie Woods, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, even though she really wanted to join the conversation. But personally, as a white woman who's largely built a career out of Indigenous people's language knowledge, I guess I've, for a long time, perhaps not long enough, been really grappling with whether this kind of work is okay, and if so, under what conditions it's okay. And I still don't have all the answers on that, but I've really learned a lot through working with Leslie. And she wrote a master's thesis on this topic, and we've been continuing to talk afterwards. She's now working on a grammar of her family's language for her PhD at ANU. So seeing the Target article really seemed like a great opportunity to take our conversation public, but also to advertise Leslie's forthcoming book. She's just on the verge of publishing her master's thesis, which everyone should buy. So a shameless plug for that one here. But in terms of, what we would add to the paper, I think really just to have greater length, we would have added a lot. There was a lot we didn't include in particularly related fields. There's a lot of really great scholarship on these issues outside of linguistics, and a lot of great Indigenous scholars who've written about these issues that I would want to go into more, certainly people like Martin Nakada here in Australia. And obviously, having now read all the responses, there's just such great stuff in there. We've also just heard from others of the authors here, and I'd really echo a lot of what they've said. So we could have, spilled huge quantities of ink responding to all the points in there, and of course going into more detail about all the points in the Target article, but I will keep it brief in there.
Thank you. Ignacio, did you want to go next?
Sure, I'll jump in. So the reason that I wrote this article is because I had come to realize that many of the ideas that I had to write about had not been written in this particular context. And actually, I hesitated to write the Target article to respond to the Target article in the beginning because I thought of what I would say. And many of the ideas that I did end up presenting in my paper were ideas that were really in circulation among a lot of people that I knew. I had heard a lot of these ideas, for example, in the field of language revitalization and reclamation, talking to scholars of color. We had talked about the structural obstacles and ways in which to challenge them. So in some ways, what I wrote felt to be too obvious. But then I came to realize that those conversations are happening in very small settings. So they are happening among scholars of color. Scholars of color are talking about the ways in which there are structural obstacles in the institution and the ways in which, for example, expectations of tenure or for promotion really do limit the kind of work that we do. And I realized that there's a lot of power in putting those into a venue such as language. And I actually drew my inspiration from the Target article because as much as I learned a lot from reading the Target article, there were also a lot of things that I was very familiar with that just hadn't been in writing before, or at least not in this kind of writing. They may be in, for example, academic Twitter, but they are not found in the pages of a journal such as Language. And I think for me, it's really important for us to elevate these ideas. So these are ideas that really people of color have been discussing for quite a while, but they just have not been given much validation. And what I have found is that when things are put in writing in these particular contexts, they have a lot of power. This is when people take them seriously, is when they are in the pages of a journal such as Language. And as much as I think that's a huge problem, that this is the only way in which a lot of these ideas are taken seriously, it also presents an opportunity for those of us who are able to take advantage of these opportunities to make it so that others can then cite our work, because that is one of the things that I am looking for as well, is to be able to cite other people's ideas, because it's not really ideas that are the circulation or the currency of our field. It's ideas in a particular venue, in a particular context. And so as much as we can contribute to that, I think that that's one of the ways in which we can move along. It's a multi-pronged process. So yes, we also want to challenge the fact that validation comes through the pages of language, but we also want to use that to whatever extent we can. And in terms of what I would like to add, it's along these same ideas. It's a different moment. It's a different moment from when these papers were written. And I think they also are providing this new moment that we have where the rhetoric has changed. And in some cases, it is just the rhetoric. We have diversity statements and statements of racial solidarity. On the other hand, those are seeds that are being planted for us to be able to take up. People are becoming a little bit more aware, and they're giving us the language that they can listen to. So I guess what I would add to the paper is to actually really look at the language that is in these diversity statements or statements of racial solidarity, and that this is the language that the people in power can hear, because this is the language that they are producing. So again, it's a multi-pronged approach in which we need to challenge some of these basic structures, but we also need to be able to leverage the mechanisms that they provide us for effecting change.
Thank you so much. I think, these perspectives and what you just talked about now about making sure that this is a literature of our discipline, I think I've just seen that in so many ways of why that's so important versus the conversations that we've had, or even our position of privilege in our jobs, because people are reaching out from all over the world, honestly, and we're not in conversation with everyone. So it goes back to that whole idea about why these publications and these video venues are important for people who don't have those conversations regularly. Other participants, I think you can definitely chime in if you wanted to add more about why you wrote the papers and how you would update them. But now I want to call some time in particular to think about next steps. How can this work continue? And what are structural barriers to this work that we would want to encourage people to take on in future articles or book chapters? I put the call to our call for papers in the link. With the structural barriers in mind, especially things that have happened since you wrote your paper and conversations you might have had since it came out. So I'm thinking, Mary, Christine, we could start that off if you want, and then we could, move there. I think the structural challenge that I see is that there are a lot of people who want to do work and they need more of the how-to information. So that's what I really am wanting people to focus on when we get to the call for papers, because people are asking questions like, oh, well, how do I generate a tenure line for a new scholar of color? Or how do I navigate these tenure and promotion policies and procedures that really have gone unchallenged because of the predominant ideas that have gone on linguistics or in our department? And so I feel like a next step for me, scholar-wise, is to figure out some of that how-to, so that we have conversations, we have documents that are kind of adjacent to other disciplines as we move forward as linguists. So that's my immediate moving forward. And I want to call on other people to kind of see what they're thinking as well.
Yeah, I can jump in here because I really echo Anne's point that one of the big challenges is people not knowing where to start. I think there's also a kind of helplessness expressed, especially again by white people in positions of structural power who kind of won't own and don't fully recognize the extent to which they do have structural power and can do things, including doing things like reaching out for help and expertise with appropriate compensation. So not just leaning on people of color in your field to help you out, or in your discipline, or in your institution to help, unless they are available for that help and you can appropriately reward that expert assistance. But part of it too is I think there's this kind of language of helplessness around whiteness, around being white, and that's kind of a protective covering that white people, including me, use to avoid our responsibilities. And so I guess the other thing that I would say is you kind of have to recognize that you do have something that you can do. And yes, you are going to make mistakes. That is the nature of it. You can do your best to try to mitigate the impact of those mistakes, to try to avoid them whenever you can, but that doesn't justify not taking action. But taking action carefully, humbly, doing your homework first, those are all the things that kind of need to happen.
I can also jump in. Oh.
That's okay. You go ahead.
I can also jump in because I wanted to kind of play off of that for a second, because one of the obstacles that I've found is just comfort, and the idea that several people, when these ideas are brought up, it's like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with my work. I'm not comfortable talking about that because that's not the like scientific nature of language. When we've seen and we've done the research to know that these things are very much incorporated in how language is used, and so I think one of the biggest obstacles is transparency and being able to talk about how history impacts the formation and mobilization of language. I also think that one of the obstacles in thinking about this is how can we, I guess people need to read more widely is what I'm thinking. So basically, outside of our field, there are people that are talking about the historical context and the social context and the anthropological context and all of the context we need to be able to understand even minute forms or linguistic forms that we focus on, but we don't read necessarily outside of our field because that feels like something that's not really related to what we're doing. So I think that's one of the obstacles too. How can we read more widely, and how can that be respected and taken up in the field as we're doing our work?
Awesome. All right, Christine, I think you'll go next, and then Michelle.
Yeah, Eris, you really said a lot of what I was going to touch on as well, which is just how productive it has been for me to talk about some of these issues and to learn about some of these issues from folks in other fields. So in addition to reading widely, which is an excellent suggestion, just also trying to sort of use our communicative skills to have those conversations with folks in other disciplines, and then really sort of understanding what it is that their insights, how their insights might be applicable to how we think about language. So again, you know, I have learned a great deal from how, you know, sociologists, anthropologists, folks in other fields think about language, and also how they think about language as a social behavior and the communicative function of language. So again, I think that's where a lot of that part of our original article came from, is understanding that linguistics can both sort of learn from and contribute to other fields, but that should not be done just as a, you know, binary, that should be sort of a productive conversation happening over time.
Michelle, yeah.
Yes, so in fact, I'd like to follow up on both Eris and the point that Christine just made. And I see in the Q&A our dear friend Arthur Spears making a similar point about linguistics being in a silo. And that's one thing which I really I deeply enjoyed in the Target article by Anne, Christine, and Mary, is this plea for linguists to go beyond the field. Because in fact, I say that in my response, and in fact, my son now is 16, is reading Frantz Fanon, and I'm so happy he's reading Frantz Fanon, because if I had read Frantz Fanon, if I had read Foucault and Bourdieu and Memmi and other scholars, not linguists, but who are interested in linguistics, I would have written a different thesis. And going beyond that, going beyond just these cross connections between linguistics and other fields, I think we also need to think about the way that outside of academia, language is used and misused. And again, because of my biography as a Haitian and now a Creolist, I see the damage being done again by even well-meaning organizations like human rights organizations, because they don't understand the importance of language as a foundation to human rights. they say one thing about human rights with one hand, and then with the other hand, they undermine that one thing because they don't understand language. They don't understand the importance of language for education, for justice, for all kinds of connected fields. So as next steps, one must ask, what can we do as linguists to go beyond just academia and have our work, like your article, and Christine and Mary, make it relevant to people in the trenches who need to understand those basic principles about how language has been used by white supremacy. And the sad part is that as a Haitian, Haiti has such a beautiful history of independence and revolution, but yet even there, the same intellectuals who are so proud of our history of independence, they don't understand that their own stance, their own linguistic practices are undermining that very dream of independence, you see? And so so I've been, for the past, actually more than a couple of years, I've been struggling with that. How can linguistics be made relevant to these cases of injustice, deep injustice? And it's not just Haiti. I mean, if you look at Hawaii, Africa, Latin America, Asia, you find it all over. So that's a big next step, but I think it's necessary.
Thank you so much. Any other respondents want to take that on? And I'm particularly curious in getting respondents' views on structural barriers within linguistics to this work as we think about now moving forward. So I think that's a critical piece for us to think about. And if anyone wants to take that one on, that's great. And if you don't, then we'll go to moving forward. And we've got lots of questions here in the Q&A. All right, so I'll just give one last call to the respondents for either structural barriers or moving forward, and then I'll roll the Q&A. Okay, Alice, thanks.
I would briefly say I think one structural barrier we need to look at, particularly for linguists working with Indigenous languages, is looking at principles of authorship and really expanding how we approach authorship in collaboration with speakers of languages, but also the expectations around particularly theses and the kind of work that's rewarded in academia, because often more applied work that may be more valued by the speech community is less valued in the academic setting, and often for no good reason.
Great. Okay, Ignacio.
And I can also just add to that, because I think it is this question of what it is that we value. And I think along these lines is what counts as publications, what are the kinds of ways in which we can expand the way in which we reward particular kinds of scholarship. And I mentioned this in my paper, but we already have an indication of the way that might look, what that might look like, because the LSA has put out a statement on the intellectual merits of language documentation. And, I can tell you for myself that I have used that language from LSA to try to convince people in my department that this is work that's worth doing. So I think one of the things that we can begin to do is maybe expand our notions, the very notions that we have about what we reward in ways that are more expansive. So for example, what if we were to reward, going off what Alice was saying, work that is responsible? And we can find ways in which we can indicate ethically responsible work, such as co-authorship. What if we reimagine the kinds of reward structures that we have? And I don't think it necessarily means tearing everything down. I think it really means getting at the heart of why we have them in the first place. So why do we have publication as one of the things that we are expecting scholars to do? Because it's about dissemination of information. We also want to have impact, but when we limit our notions of what kind of impact we have to just the field, then it means that only certain publication venues are going to be rewarded. But instead, if what we think of is having an impact on academia in general, or having an impact on communities, then maybe we broaden our understanding of what counts as something that is worth rewarding.
Thank you so much. I think it's so important for us to, think about that and have some scholarly discussion about that. And I think Wes is going to come on and add some more to that conversation.
Gee, I can try. I'm enjoying what other people are saying. Regarding sort of structural barriers to sort of everything that we've been talking about, or just the advancement of linguistics, I think one of the huge structural barriers is the discipline itself, the fact that it exists as a named discipline and therefore sort of leads to certain siloed structures, particularly in universities where there's a linguistics department, and then there's actually sort of linguistics in a broader sense, which occurs in many cases outside of that department. One of the huge things I think we must do is to break down those silos. And one of the structural barriers I see with respect to that is that so often linguistics positions, faculty positions, research positions are administered through linguistics departments and only through linguistics departments. Say, for example, where there's going to be a new hire. And of course, that doesn't happen very much nowadays, but it does happen some. And everybody on the search committee is from that department. And therefore, sort of all of these other issues, the kinds of things that are widely talked about across academia and beyond, are in many cases left out. I see a question in the Q&A about the marginalization of linguists who are in departments other than linguistics. So I'm a linguist in a department other than linguistics. I'm in ethnic studies specifically, and actually I don't know that it leads to my marginalization so much as it leads to sort of my work not really being understood, particularly with respect to the more technical areas of linguistics. And yet it's also tremendously freeing because my work in language reclamation has to be interdisciplinary, sort of by definition. I can't sort of consider language in some sort of a narrow context. I have to consider all of these things all at the same time. That then leads, however, to an observation that I'll share, or something I'll share about myself, which is that I'm pretty hesitant to go into most linguistics departments because I think that I would be marginalized there. Linguistic departments, like in order to be more inclusive, must create more structures, to bring in sort of language scholars from elsewhere in the university. And I think one huge part of that happens in the hiring process, as well as in the review, assessment, evaluation process that must go beyond the departments in structural ways.
I think that's so important, Wes, in terms of responding to the question in the chat, is looking at, moving away from this idea that the reality is, we need to recruit people to our department or recruit to linguists, and realizing that people of color are doing language all over universities, all over the world. And why we're not in conversation with that reality, I think is going to move us into a realistic picture of what's going on at this point. And so I thank you for kind of bringing that lens to the conversation. All right, a couple of last minutes for our panelists to just give us some ideas as people form their questions about how should we move forward? What should happen next? And just anything you'd want us to be thinking about. And then we see the great questions coming in. I want to encourage people to go ahead and start loading questions because our panelists have been responding to them, and we'll respond to them in the last half hour as well. But anybody just want to address moving forward before we go to Q&A?
Anne, could I say something?
Yes.
Hi, thanks. I said I didn't want to talk, but then I just couldn't help it because this is so interesting. But I have the observation that, so I'm here in Northern Europe, and I wish that what I had written was that we need to really address the structural issue dealing with our own problems here, because I think it's really easy for people to kind of look at what you all have done, which is so valuable, but to think that doesn't apply here. We don't have racism. We're so perfect. We're so complacent. We're kind of smug, there's not a lot of diversity, but it's always there. And we need to not be complacent. And no matter where we are in the world, no matter what the situation is, there's going to be some kind of exclusion in our departments. Dig deeper and try to find it. So that's what I'm going to try to do. That's what I'm inspired by this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Ignacio, do you want to pull from there?
I just want to add on to that. One of the things that I have realized is that a lot of times this who does this work is often pushed to, well, I don't have power. I don't have any influence. And I think one thing that I want us all to think about is that again, it's variable. Some people have more power and more influence, but we all have some kind of power and influence. So I'm a junior faculty member, and a lot of times we are the ones that are told, wait until tenure, don't do the work now. But the fact is we have some power right now. We sit on hiring committees. We vote on hires. We participate in admissions positions or in admissions committees for entering students. And I think this idea of like, how can it apply to me personally is something that we should all be asking ourselves. Because I often do see where people say, oh, well, I'm doing this because my chair is telling me this, or because the dean is telling me this. But actually, we all have some kind of work that we can do. So if we can just take ownership of that, and yet recognizing that the people that have more responsibility or that have more power definitely should bear the burden of the responsibility, but recognizing that, as Elizabeth was just saying, not saying, oh, that's for somebody else, but rather thinking, okay, what piece of this can I take for myself to try to effect some kind of change? So taking some kind of ownership of that is one of the things that I think I would really want to stress, not pushing it off to somebody else.
Great. Oh, great. Eris, do you want to come on in?
Yeah, I can add one more thing. So some of the things I've been thinking about is just having more events like this where we're leveraging our, professional associations and organizations in order to celebrate the work of people that sometimes hasn't been seen as central to the field, and doing that with other organizations that we also exist in. I'm still thinking about that question of how do we answer to the marginalization of linguists who are not in linguistics departments. And I think that a lot of those linguists see themselves in other professional organizations. And so there's going to have to be some sort of, the same way that we're advocating for collaboration between scholars who are in the field, there might have to be some sort of collaboration between professional organizations. And so that it's looking more like world language conferences in the same way that the American Association for Sciences, I think it's called, it does a more wide-ranging conference where we're getting to celebrate the fact that this work is really expansive. And then we can go back to our smaller conferences and think about that work in more directed ways. But I think we need to leverage the fact that all of us exist within these professional organizations, and that those organizations can help make this work be seen and more visible.
Thank you. And I definitely do want to put a plug in for the American Association for Advancement of Science, who really, it was great to be able to give a topical lecture. And as Eris said, this week, my whole team, including Eris, was helping me prep, and just having those conversations across areas and getting away from, well, this is linguistics and this isn't, as I think is going to be a crucial step for inclusion. Okay, any participants have a last word? And then I'm going to start going to the questions, because they're coming in and they're just fantastic. So I just want to give people one last chance. And I would say moving forward, modeling is going to be so key. And I think I got some questions in advance of today. And one question people asked is how are we making this work in an equitable way, given the inclusion and diversity that we have here at Santa Barbara and in the project, getting this work done. And I think it's a fantastic question, because workflow is real. It's real for scholars of color who are often asked to do service, asked to be the ones to historically repair the injustices done to them, as if it was a matter of course that now you will do all of your work and you will do this repair. And I think one great thing in terms of writing this as 3 people is it allowed us to split up the work. So often I would kind of come in with ideas that I think needed to really be in the linguistic literature. Christine and Mary and I would have conversations about that. And so then we would trade off our ideas, and we all have other areas that we have extensive either education or training in. So for me, it's psychology, for Christine, it's sociology, and for Mary, it's anthropology. And using that as our conversation, that gave us an interdisciplinary lens that we're hoping goes towards transdisciplinarity. So the way the workflow often goes, and I think this is a good model for having teams that are cross-racial and trying to do things, is that I'm out working with students and people of color in ways that often white people can't or decide not to. Christine works a lot on the development of those ideas and those lenses. Mary comes in with her more senior scholar view, integrates the literature, and then we pass it around. And Christine and I have been working like that for over 15 years at this point. And it's great now to have Mary and her West Coast, different perspectives into that conversation. So I encourage you all to really be thinking not just about ideas and topics and models, but how you can use inclusive practices and policies that we know from higher education work and adapt those into linguistics. That's things like pre-review of articles, really supporting junior scholars rather than just having a culture of rejection driving our discipline, and really having critical conversations on your campus for departments and programs that have been successful in inclusion, and looking at what works locally, structurally, and then continuing this conversation that we hope to do across the discipline. So to do that, we will now turn to questions. So I will read the questions. I know a lot of people in here are logged in under different names and such, but the idea is get these questions out, see which respondents have things to say, and we'll do this now for a half an hour. First question that I'll take here. I wonder if the panelists might speak to the marginalization of linguists and their students who are in departments other than linguistics. That's English, languages, and education. And those departments and programs historically tend to be more diverse. So the idea is, what plans do linguistic departments have to be more inclusive? So I'd love to hear from panelists your take on that. And if you're seeing things happen in your departments or programs, let us know. All right, so we got no takers on that question from our panel. But one thing I will say is that, oh, Mary, here comes Mary and Alice. There has been a lot of conversations going on. So I'll let Mary and Alice kind of lead on that, and then we'll go from there. Mary, you go first, and then Alice.
Yeah, sorry, I should say the garbage truck is right outside, so hopefully I can get this said without it being way too noisy. But I do think that this is sort of challenging because there is diversity. So for example, lots of Latinx students are drawn to our Spanish department or Spanish departments around the country, but Spanish departments, of course, are very conservative intellectually. And so there's sort of this real problem where the intellectual tradition of that department doesn't always, especially with regard to literature, which is usually weighted heavily even in programs where there is a linguistics element. But I think that that maybe complicates the picture because you've got a lot of people who could be contributing so much to the field, but the gatekeeping practices from the level of hiring to graduate admissions to students being told that their variety of Spanish is wrong. Those kinds of things I think are kind of one of the challenges that I'm just thinking of Spanish departments because I know a certain amount about them. But I think this is an issue, kind of the colonial legacy of these departments. This is something that linguists in linguistics departments and in language departments need to work on together. And I have to say, I have not been doing a great job of that because I'm still kind of learning about this issue. But I think that we have a lot to learn from language departments about how to work with the larger numbers of students of color that are coming to those departments generally, and what has worked and what hasn't. So there's kind of a natural potential for collaboration there.
I also just wanted to mention a very small but practical step that I think is already happening in a lot of places, and that is developing relationships across departments via graduate student committees. So having input from the staff members across, or faculty across different programs that way.
I'm going to just jump in to echo that as someone who has been working in an interdisciplinary department for the past 15 years. It suits me, but also I think it helps all of us who are in the department and connected to the department grow. We're a core unit that's connected to 9 or 10 different departments. And that means that our PhD students' dissertation committees are interdisciplinary at the core. And I just really profit from those interdisciplinary conversations that come out of that intellectual engagement across fields. And it's a very unique space. I would love to see more departments and programs that have that structural interdisciplinarity built in. So it may not, we have the model now of maybe an external scholar from a different department who joins the committee, but truly having those departments, those committees that are comprised of people at the core from different departments, I think yields rich work. And certainly there are, challenges that you have to work through sometimes, but the conversations are really interesting and leads to new intellectual development. So I have enjoyed being in that structural position in my career.
Great. And I think it's important to think about this, as you're saying, all the way, I'm always going to be pushing for undergraduates. So be thinking about those cross-listing realities, be thinking about those target majors that you want to involve students in. And I think, if you can't do it at the committee level or the hiring level if they're never an undergraduate thinking about these questions. So I think that's really important to start on that structural level. Another great question came in talking about parts in our paper where we talk about issues related to research on the language gap and about collecting data about race and psycholinguistics. And the question asks, do you have advice or insights to share with those of us doing experimental work in language acquisition and psycholinguistics? I've been thinking, this question says, I've been thinking about it a lot in recent years and actively educating myself and having interdisciplinary discussions with colleagues, but I would love to hear panelists' thoughts about how to make progress in these particular lines of research. So anyone want to take on first, really thinking about how does this go in depth more in psycholinguistic experimental work?
I'm not a psycholinguist, so I'm not going to answer it from that perspective, but I will say that one of the things that we talked about is just really when you're going to be doing experimental work, to make sure that you are questioning your questions, right? So when that work is being done, the base assumptions that guide the questions that are being asked often reflect kind of dominant ideologies. And so making sure that prior to starting any kind of experimental work, you're actually doing a kind of qualitative analysis of your questions within a particular community. That's all I have for that.
Great. Yeah, I think the community aspect is real. I mean, we're going to have to get real about impact. We're starting to see those, those impact statement models come into linguistics. There was a job ad that came out from the UK that asked for impact. It was ironic because I just talked about that modeling in my graduate seminar the night before. So we're gonna have to start getting real about who the work is for, who's the audience for the scholarly work, who's engaging in terms of academics and basic research models, and who are not. And I think for psycholinguistics and experimental models, which is still my background training, we're going to have to get real about what type of models scholars of color are employing in their work. And this is particularly coming from psychology and social psychology, and seeing where our models vary from those types of models and how that language information should be drafted in. And so there's very important work going on in social psychology right now that I meet and talk to a lot of social psychologists, especially Black ones, and we just are trying to figure out why that overlap hasn't occurred. So maybe some of us on the webinar, people who watch this, we can start thinking about the work that the Spark Society is doing. So that's a group that is made up of linguists and cognitive scientists of color. I'm going to put their link in the chat. And it may be just time to kind of thinking about that overlap realistically in terms of impact and partnership with scholars in those adjacent areas. But I think as Eris said, this idea of humanistic, making these differentials between this being humanistic research or experimental research, one of the things scholars of color are saying that those lines don't blur down that way. And so when we look at that, we may need larger research teams, people who are coming from those different angles. Ignacio, do you want to weigh in on that?
So a little bit, actually, what I want to do is highlight one of the things that was mentioned in the chat. I think it's actually Arthur Spears, but it's under Sonia Lanehart. But it's this idea that we seem to think that certain areas of science in general, but we're talking about specifically linguistic theory, are objective, and that our subjectivities don't really play a role into it. And I think this gets to some of the things that were mentioned in the Q&A, in the chat, is that even areas such as phonetics, phonology, or psycholinguistics, all of these kinds of areas, some of them we tend to think are objective in a way that where race doesn't play a role. And I think any kind of science, whether it's linguistic science or any other kind of science, the positionality of the researcher plays a role. And I think one of the things that might be important for all of us to do is to actually make explicit these subjectivities are positionalities, which is what Arthur was saying in the chat. That's one of the ways in which we can begin to acknowledge that even this work that we think is completely empirical and data driven, to say, actually, no, all of this occurs in a particular framework, to do what Eris is saying, and think about the kinds of questions that we're asking, because the kinds of questions that we're asking, they themselves carry a lot of cultural assumptions that we may not be aware of. And that is particularly true of people that are operating from a dominant cultural perspective or from dominant theories. So one small step that we can take is to all of us start recognizing our positionalities and where we're coming from in the ways that we're doing this work. So that's maybe one step that we can start to take.
I think it's so important and so real. And at the AAAS this week, I talked about in this model of, we need to be real about our partnerships too. So are we doing this work in a way that is really in partnership with people from communities, that's other scholars, that's undergraduates, that's graduate students, that's postdoctoral scholars? And if we are not, we need to really start publishing and writing in why we can't do that, so that our readers and audiences can, start to contend with that, and so that it helps us get those resources to make that plan. And I think that goes into this next question, this idea, Sally Coco I put in the comments, is that linguistics developed in the Western world, grounded in the Western perspective onto the rest of the world. And Sally says that most of this took place during the colonial period, right, with people who are indigenous and native having no voice. And to date, linguists from former colonies are expected to follow with that traditional Western bias rather than to contribute alternate perspectives, although some people, including Sally, have succeeded in drawing attention to alternate perspectives. However, there are many voices that have been silenced for one reason or another. And I think linguistics should work harder at decolonizing the discipline. And so I think one of the things we really need to think about, as Sally says, is unsilencing those people and making sure that those perspectives are integrated in any model that we have about this going forward. And that includes in our discipline's reliance on positivity or objectivity, as if that is, in a sense, what we say in the cultural studies, colorblind, which is an impossible thing and an undesirable thing as well. Okay, yes.
So I'd like to amplify the point that Sally is making. I think Sally might be very polite in making it, but I think that we also need to look at the way, say, editors of journal process submissions from linguists with a different perspective. So I can say, actually, now a few years have passed, so I've healed from that wound, but I remember actually submitting to language a paper, where I was taking issue with this basic paradigm of Creoles being exceptional. And I think one of the editors responded, well, but they are exceptional, and they do have a special history, don't they? When in fact, the very argument in the paper was to actually show that they don't. But the editor took it for granted that my view was heretic, and that the journal's view, putting Creoles in a separate box, was the one to be assumed. So I think, to really do justice to Sally's suggestion, we require very hard work on the part of journals to really check in the biases from the get-go in the very process of reviewing papers and deciding which can be published or not. And I don't know exactly how to go about that concretely, because it takes so much humility to be able to do that. But I think it's kind of things that your paper should help with, right? The paper about realizing the history of the field and understanding that our assumptions are loaded with that history. But that requires this kind of self-reflection that might not be so easy for many. So maybe the audience will have more feedback on that, how to accomplish that particular type of self-reflection, to be able to check in your biases, even as linguists, as reviewers.
Thank you. Any other comments or ideas? And I'll just add another question to that that's come in, is that how can we link up with fellow travelers? These are other scholars and people in communities who are doing important work. And the question comes in with an anthropology, especially from that perspective, but I think it's great to ask about this from all perspectives. So how do we do that linking? Many of you all are, we on the respondents are doing that, but it's great to kind of get that perspective going. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
I'm going to jump in one more time. I think that one of the ways that we can do it is through public scholarship. I think a lot of people on this call are pretty active in different kind of social media spheres, but also creating ways. I think during this pandemic, we've become very adept at creating online spaces where people are coming together from all over. And that's opened up our field and our knowledges to a lot more people than would have previously had access. So I think one issue is an issue of access, making sure that we're sharing more widely in ways that are accessible to more people. And then the other one is that I think that people who are a little bit more high up can have conversations across fields about what other people are doing in order to also open up the kind of siloed natures of their field. As a student who, does linguistics and anthropology and sociology and all of these things, I have to say that it has been just as difficult to get anthropologists to see linguistic anthropology as valid anthropology as it is to get linguists to see linguistic anthropology as valid linguistics. So I think there has to be conversations at the top levels of all of those disciplines, and then we need to be more public about the kind of scholarship that we're doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Eris. I think that's such an important perspective. And I think, as we keep going, I just there's some great specific questions that kind of play this out in different areas just to get people thinking. So here's a question that we may get answers to. If not, I just want to make sure it's out there. The question says that we need to pay attention to who gets chosen and or paid to do translation work involving Indigenous languages. This includes situations when people in communities call for help with translation. And so the question here is that the university referred to community members, to non-Indigenous speakers of the Indigenous language to do the work. And so thinking about that privileging of expertise, I think has to be part of this larger conversation. So I don't know if anyone wanted to comment on that or say anything, but I just wanted to make sure that we had that as part of the discourse.
I want to make a comment about that, and this is really more about sort of privileging expertise in general, where oftentimes expertise is privileged in reference to folks who are in the academy at the expense of members of the language communities sort of involved in a particular area. I think this very, very much needs to change. One of the particular issues that comes up a lot that I hear is that in language documentation work, knowledge of a language is viewed as expertise, and yet people are reduced to the status of speaker or sort of language use, and they're expected to sort of produce data. And yes, they might be compensated for their time, but the broader areas of expertise, the relational expertise, or the fact that they have occupations aside from being a speaker of a language, all of that gets left out almost entirely. Another issue, of course, is that peer review is based on so-called experts in a given field. I think it must include, where appropriate, members of language communities who are not actually in the academy, but nevertheless have the appropriate expertise. At least in the academy, in theory, not always in practice, when people are providing that type of service, the ideas that will fall within our jobs, that, like in my case, I'm paid as a professor, and so when I'm reviewing manuscripts or whatnot, I don't necessarily need to be paid because I'm paid through my regular salary. But if that is not the case, elsewhere, of course, that that type of reciprocity would need to be brought in. So I think what I'm saying here is really just that expertise more generally needs to be sort of rethought. And anytime credentialed experts, in many cases who are not members of the language communities in question, are called upon or viewed as experts, or are given titles of expertise, like say in a documentary or in a newspaper story, that refers to language community members as community members, even though they also have expertise. Those sorts of things are going to further racism and racist structures, and they need to stop.
I think that's so important, right? That Christine and I say in our models with the work we've done with educators is that we're just there as facilitators, collecting the knowledge and expertise that already exists in schools and communities. And that model is so, just part and parcel to community-based participatory research. And so I think, having people really think about that critically and what we're doing, Wes, as you say, with respect to the structural racism that enforces, allows, enables, and really replicates is such an important way of thinking about why partnership is so important as anti-racist behavior. So other good questions that are coming in basically is, I'll just read some of them and we'll see who jumps in. How does a theory of race and language, as you all understand it, account for cross-racial relationality that moves away from dominant ways of understanding social diversity in the academy? So this is the idea of like rejecting multicultural models and coming up with theories that we find are more pertinent and progressive to our work. So I just wanted to have anybody have a question. Have anyone who had comments about our theories of race and language and how this work informs that. One of the things we've contended in this work and in other work is that we need to form our theories. Like we can't just go out and do things without that type of theory because it'll get there. So I'm kind of curious if people have ideas. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. If not, Eris. Okay, go ahead.
And I want to make a comment also. It's not really answering the question, it's more just making
an
additional comment. Just that we're talking about sort of the need for better sort of theories of race and its intersection with language in ways that brings in all of these other things. I want to observe that even though the field of linguistics has been behind in this area, I think all linguists do have a theory of race and are operating based on a certain understanding of race and racism. In many cases, I think people are operating on flawed assumptions, thinking of racism as sort of an individual ideology, something that other people have that any given person would not have, except maybe sort of bigoted people. I just wanted to sort of make that point here, is that
it's an important point.
We're not starting from ground. We're not starting from the
yes,
the baseline. People actually do have theories, and in some cases, those theories need to be greatly expanded.
Eris, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I was going to actually start with like a very similar comment that we are working within a frame, right? It's not like we haven't talked about race or we haven't talked about even ethnicity. It's just that it's been categorized as this kind of static category that can be quantified in certain ways. And so For me, I think working with young people has really helped me. So working with people who are in periods of transition, and I think a lot about working with my middle schoolers who are going into high school, and how they're like, Miss Clemens, when I get to high school, I'm gonna go by my middle name. And I'm like, all of a sudden they're a different person, right? And so I think that understanding of the like mutability of individuals helps kind of think about the theories of race that we need to be applying, and we need to be understanding when we're making our assumptions about language in particular communities.
I think that's so important. And I think, in terms of thinking about these models, there's just so much we have to kind of state for our community and build them out, which is why I really wanted to ask that question from that point of view, because I think it's you all's take on it is so important, is that to not have a racial theory does not mean you don't have one, and it doesn't mean you're not acting from that lens. Here's a question that comes up. And it's been really pertinent to ask me in different forms since the paper came out. So I just want to give people a chance to think about it. I agree with Ignacio about the increasing participation of junior faculty in decision-making within the department. My concern, though, is mainly regarding voicing our ideas about racial issues, inclusion, and diversity beyond our departments and institutions. How about the risks of being intimidated by colleagues in positions of power, some of what we saw last summer on social media in particular, and this relates then to who our potential reviewers of tenure and promotion files are. I feel I've gotten so many versions of this question. How do we deal with the real threat that white supremacy and racism causes? And how do we deal with this on the day-to-day? So I just wanted to see if anybody had any comments that they wanted to make about this question and this concern, like that doing this work makes us vulnerable in very specific and articulated ways. Ignacio?
Well, I can start by, first of all, completely agreeing with that point, that it is a scary position to be in. And I think the best thing that I have found has been to have allies. And I think, that means that if you are in this more vulnerable position, finding people who are allies in your department and the linguistics community as a whole, I think that's one way in which I have found myself to have some kind of protection. And another is relying on, this is one of the reasons why I actually think the Target article was just so critically important, because relying on that as a kind of defense to say, actually, look, there are other scholars who are taking these positions as well. I think that's another way in which you can find some ways to protect yourself. But I will say, I don't know how this turns out. I don't know whether people that are in these vulnerable positions will eventually get enough allies. I don't actually know. So there's a way in which you have to, I think, just take a leap of faith. And what I find at least somewhat motivating is to say, well, but this work is important. And I think if I believe in this work, then hopefully this is the kind of thing that will be recognized, especially given that we are now in a moment where there are many, many more allies, I think, than there were before. And that's one of the ways in which I can draw some kind of motivation for the work. But yeah, ultimately, I don't know. I don't know whether this is really too precarious a position. I think I'm just sort of operating with this sense of, I believe this work is important, and I believe that there are other people out there who are supportive. So I would say that the biggest suggestion I would have is to find allies.
Thank you. And I'm tying this in to a couple other questions that are related. I'm addressing the connections between this work, anti-racism efforts, and anti-sexism efforts, and even thinking about everyday barriers to this. Who's called on in meetings, who are moderators, who are chosen for panels, right? This type of really important structural inventory that I feel that we need to take note of. And I was wondering if anybody wanted to address those connections between racism efforts, sexism efforts, or any other types of efforts, and how that relates to our particular focus on race. I think from my perspective, there's a reason why a lot of, Black women in particular, we are socialized to take the fire. It's part of the culture, but it's getting old, it's getting tired, it wears on the body, it wears on the soul. So my perspective on all of this is thinking about that perspective of who has to do the work, not putting all fear aside and personal risk, so that other people can be supported and so that you feel like you have a fuller survival. And I think that's got to be important for me as, you think about why would we write this paper at this point of our career in this way? I mean, the traditional rhetoric that I was socializing is that we do not have a choice, that I can't be a fully functional linguist without this type of discussion occurring, because of what would happen. It would just not be a full career intellectually, socially, practically, or professionally. So when I kind of think about those fear and risk, I think of them as being very real, but think about all the people who can evade them and still be fine, rather than those of us who do this work because we must. And I think, that puts a different spin on what you choose to do if you are a white scholar or a scholar of a different race, but also if you are a Black scholar, there is a tradition of responsibility. And if white people don't understand that, these things can be interpreted in really different ways. And I feel like that played out a lot in what I've seen since the papers have gone out, comments and questions that have been made to me, and how this all even plays out on social media and in the real world. And so for me to socialize a generation or two of linguists who don't have that responsibility betrays everything that I know in terms of what is real about being Black and what is real with this social construct of race, where it's left us in America. Okay, so we have 1 minute left. Anna, did you have a quick comment before we close down?
Yeah. I just wanted to add, actually bouncing off of that, I wanted to add some comments about allyship in general as we've been talking about it. Because my collaboration with Eris, for us, it's been this effort that, yes, has revealed our own individual strengths as scholars, but also we want to do it to make a statement about how collaboration can forge this sort of allyship that can be this co-conspiratorial bond, basically, against the structural barriers that we are finding in the academy, and that we have this bond basically to, yes, in some ways, kind of, I guess, balance the ways that we would both individually be perceived with our work, but also to resist a lot of the messaging that comes our way as far as what we are supposed to be exploring and what we're supposed to be sticking to within our discipline. So actually, just in terms of what we want to see going forward, we really do encourage this sort of collaboration as a form of allyship and as a form of co-conspiring that can help kind of resist those structural barriers, just in terms of the strength in numbers things, and kind of taking our individual positionalities and showing how together we can kind of challenge
that. Thank you. It's such a great model to make sure that burden model does not persist. I want to thank all of you all who have attended today live. We want to keep this conversation going in publication. We want to keep it going in our virtual spaces, and if we ever get to see ourselves again in person. Thanks to all of the panelists, all of the people who took time to write responses that were published in Language, responses that have appeared in other venues and places. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with linguists throughout the world. So thank you all. We will wrap up just on time. I don't know, David, did you have anything you wanted to say at the end?
You basically said it, and just thank you on behalf of the LSA to all the panelists for taking the time, both the authors of the original article and the respondents, and to all of you in the audience for your terrific questions and an overall just really spectacular webinar. I just hope this is the beginning of a model for a much longer and fruitful conversation going forward.
Thank you. And yes, thank you all panelists. So this video, we'll edit out the front a little bit, and we will put it on the Linguistics Society of America YouTube page. So if you had people who couldn't make it, go ahead and let them know.
to click subscribe or like on the LSA website page. It'll be up there, and I'll tweet it out and spread the word on social media when it's there. Thank you all so much. Have a great long weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Bye.